William Patterson stood in the Panama sun and looked out to the vessels of the nascent Scottish merchant fleet in the glistening waters of the Bay of Darien. He listened to the sound of the settlers in the village, the warm air waving the saltire slowly and proudly above New Edinburgh, as if to confirm divine endorsement of this historic achievement. Here was the defiant act of Scottish enterprise that would see it rival England and the East India Company on the global stage. Here lay the door to the seas, the key of the universe, the bulwark of a new Scottish empire that would rescue the nation from famine and destitution. Here, in a place called Darien on the Isthmus of Panama, a narrow spit of land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, lay New Caledonia, Scotland's very own plantation. Getting here had been a long, challenging battle in the face of adversity. The Union of the Crowns in 1603 had not brought the parity and economic benefits to Scotland it had initially promised, leaving the country increasingly financially dependent upon England. While a free trade arrangement had at first existed between Scotland and England, and Cromwell's Commonwealth experiment had legally acknowledged it, in reality, commerce with England was anything but free. The restoration of the Stuarts in 1660 had seen Scotland regain its political independence, but little in the way of financial security. The Navigation Acts of 1660 and 1663, which decreed shipments from the colonies could only be carried to England in English ships or those of the country of origin, had severely curtailed Scotland's access to the one nation free trade that the Union of the Crowns was supposed to deliver. The entire Scottish annual revenue amounted to little more than what the English economy brought in every 2 weeks. The Scottish economy had been in dire straits for much of the century due to the cost of endless religious warfare, and in the 1690s this was compounded by consecutive poor harvests, famine and disease. The Jacobites considered what they called King William's ill years as punishment from God for the Glorious Revolution. Scotland was a small nation with an even smaller population, only around 1 million people, and most of these lived in rural areas. At the end of the 17th century, only around 5% of Scotland's population lived in urban areas of over 10,000 people. Most of Edinburgh's 30,000 citizens were poverty-stricken, housed in cramped tenements along the high street, while Glasgow's population were in similarly abysmal conditions. The surest way to turn around the country's fortunes, the merchant class reasoned, was for Scotland to embark on an ambitious project that would allow it to compete with the other European nations in the enormously lucrative trading of African and West Indian sugar, tobacco and, of course, slaves. At the start of the 17th century, only Spain and Portugal possessed global empires, but the Dutch Republic harboured imperial ambitions of its own, as did France and England. The potential subjugation and enslavement, profits to be made from trade with India, the Far East and the East Indies sparked a race between European nations to secure these lucrative virgin markets. Over the 17th century, the Dutch had developed the Joint Stock Company, whereby public investment was secured to make expeditions and establish colonies that, if successful, would provide significant return to the company's stakeholders, and a stock exchange where said investments, or stocks, could be traded. These joint stock companies were the prototypes of today's modern corporations, and the Dutch model was hugely influential, not least, unsurprisingly, in England. The English East India Company, granted a royal charter by Elizabeth I in 1600, had grown from a small trading interest into a colossal, quasi-sovereign juggernaut, generating astounding profits and wielding a power greater than any nation state. As we saw last time, the Stuart King Charles II had formed the slave-trading Royal African Company in 1679, run by none other than his brother, the then Duke of York and now exiled Jacobite figurehead, King James VII and II. the enormous revenue streams of the Royal African and East India Companies enabled them to provide loans to English monarchs in return for a monopoly on trade with the East Indies, and this is among the reasons that England's credit rating was so high. William was able to borrow heavily to support his war with France, but the French economy was facing disaster due to Louis's constant war, extravagance, and France's inefficient and outdated systems of taxation. It should come as little surprise that hitherto Scotland had seen little of the astonishing profits these companies were making across the globe. While individual Scottish elites may have subscribed to the East India Company, Scotland itself did not possess the financial security of the English state. As we'll see, quite the opposite. Its credit rating was near zero, and thus Scotland could not secure the massive loans from the East India Company that England could. To compound matters, Scotland could not trade its way out of financial crisis either. The Dutchman's coup and declaration of war on France in 1688 had had the effect of disrupting traditional Scottish commerce with continental Europe, because now many of the territories in question were officially enemies of Britain. Legal Scottish commerce was restricted to domestic, French and increasingly English markets, but the English Parliament enacted punitive customs duties on the main Scottish exports like salt, coal, linen and cattle, a deliberately ruinous strategy designed to keep Scotland in its place, that is, as many Whigs increasingly thought of it, a vassal state. This systemic economic repression was a result of the English merchant class reluctance to cede one iota of their rapidly growing economic agency, especially not to the Scots, a descriptor which the English establishment used pejoratively in the same way that they did Irish, that is, to rhyme with scum. The Gaels of Ireland and Scotland were considered lesser, subhuman people, there to be civilised and dragged into modernity by English dominion. But this openly racist, laughably ignorant and colonialist way of thought was prevalent among the powerful lawyers, financiers and politicians of the new political class in London and Edinburgh alike. We know from the Glencoe saga how the supposedly backward Gaels threatened English and Lowland profit, which made them essentially enemies of the state. In Ireland, Gaels were subject to increasingly discriminatory laws prohibiting their doing things like running schools, holding public office, or even owning weapons. By the latter half of the 17th century, the network of drove roads had become well established across the Scottish Highlands, with great herds of black cattle being driven considerable distances from the northwest coast and the Isles to be sold in Crieff and Falkirk, where English traders could avoid the high levies south of the border. Similar circumvention of trade laws occurred in Glasgow, which emerged as a key commercial hub for the smuggling of contraband, such as tobacco from Virginia and sugar from the West Indies, while Scottish wool, coal, linen, deer hide and grindstones made their way in the opposite direction over the Atlantic to the American colonies. The English policies of repression had actually seen Scotland seek out alternative options to get round them, and many of these new trade networks would come to be coveted by English merchants. Now that William's reign had, ironically, freed the Scottish Parliament of the restrictive Lords of the Articles, giving it more freedom and independence from the Crown, the Scottish Parliament began to make its feelings increasingly plain. In 1693, it passed an Act for Encouraging Foreign Trade, a bond which stressed the great advantages that may redound to this nation by promoting a trade to the coast of Africa, America, and other foreign parts. Montgomery's club survived his exile to France and became known as the Cavaliers, translation Jacobites, who were gaining greater representation in Parliament. Meanwhile, the Whig majority were paralysed by feuding factionalism, and to combat the Cavaliers, William installed James Douglas, the exceptionally wealthy Duke of Queensberry, to ascending roles culminating in Lord High Commissioner. However, Queensberry proved ineffective in quelling the Jacobites, partly, ironically enough, due to the Scottish Parliament's abject lack of funding. Its economy was in constant recession, and when the 7 ill years of famine, which saw 2 failed harvests and several poor yields between 1691 and 1698 struck the nation, the situation in Scotland deteriorated into the kind of conditions we would today associate with a so-called third world country. Heavy rains meant mines were constantly being flooded, frequent gale-force storms wreaked havoc on buildings and infrastructure, and roads, ports and dwellings fell into disrepair. Scotland may have been home to a thriving intellectual movement, with several esteemed universities, but most of its million inhabitants did not have the leisure of such bourgeois pursuits. At this time, Scotland had one of the very poorest populations in Europe. Their poverty was absolute. Many went door to door begging, while some fell dead in the street. The Gaeltacht was hit hardest by the failed harvests. The folk of the Highlands struggled to produce a sufficient yield from their stony, barely fertile soil at the best of times. In winter they were often forced to bleed their cattle and boil the blood into cakes, and the shortage of basic staples such as peas, beans and, most importantly, oatmeal brought unimaginable hardship and misery to the Highlands. With no fodder, much of their livestock died from starvation, condemning many Gaels to a similar fate. "God help the poor people," wrote one observer in 1696, "for I never did see such outcries for want of meal." As if this wasn't bad enough, Scotland was then decimated by diseases such as typhus, dysentery and smallpox, the close-knit tenements and open sewers of urban areas providing ideal conditions for infections to spread. The death tolls were so high that bodies were piled up by the roadsides, and it's estimated that the population of Scotland was reduced by a whopping 13% thanks to these 7 ill years. In a bid to escape the horror, around 50,000 Scots in the southwest of the country fled to Ulster, England, or to join the armies of Sweden, Germany and even Russia. In all, nearly a fifth of Scotland's population were lost to hunger, disease and emigration over the 1690s. Clearly, the Jacobites were not short of rhetorical ammunition. Not only were Scottish taxes being used to fund a Dutch war with Scotland's main trading partner, the great number of men of working age being shipped to the front lines created a labour shortage in the country. The nation appeared to be in a death spiral, a destitute pauper on the European periphery, dependent upon the charity of others. Through the gloom, however, William Paterson and a group of Edinburgh merchants glimpsed sunlit uplands. Paterson was determined to reshape Scotland's image as an economic powerhouse rather than a poor, backwards-facing country of noble martyrs more concerned with their past than their future. To achieve this vision, Scotland must be bold, adventurous and ambitious. A colony, or plantation, should be established in an area lucrative for global trade, providing merchants with a point of trade that hopefully the East India Company did not. Paterson had been hawking this idea since the mid-1680s, but mainly due to his lack of charisma, his ideas had generally bored rather than excited his audiences. That is, until now. As we know, in May of 1695, it was unexpectedly announced by Tweeddale, William's Commissioner to Parliament, that William was open to the Glencoe inquiry. But this was not the only surprise Tweeddale had in store for the assembled Convention of the Estates. If they found it would tend to the advancement of trade that an act be passed for the encouragement of such as should acquire and establish a plantation in Africa or America, or any other part of the world where plantations might lawfully be acquired, His Majesty was willing to declare that he would grant to his subjects in Scotland, in favour of their plantations, such rights and privileges as he was accustomed to grant to the subjects of his other dominions. After the decades of destitution, the estates and the wider Scottish public saw this as the light at the end of the tunnel. A Scots colony under the protection of the Royal Navy was a bright future indeed. The only question was where. Well travelled and having come into a small personal fortune, Patterson had set up in London as a merchant and founded the Bank of England. Patterson had heard tell of a tropical idyll called Darien in the Caribbean, a green land of plenty where the sun always shone, where crops grew without cultivation, where noble Indians knew where gold might be found, and crucially located at a point where the short land journey across the isthmus to the Pacific would save merchant seamen a long and dangerous voyage around Cape Horn. Darien would allow Scotland to broker trade between East and West, making a very handsome profit in the process. Patterson, sensing that the iron was hot, set about wining and dining various merchants and ex-military officers, sounding out potential interest and lobbying the relevant parties in Edinburgh so that his vision might be floated before the Parliament. It worked. On June the 26th, just a week after the report of the Glencoe inquiry, the Convention of the Estates passed an Act in favour of the Scots Company trading to Africa and the Indies. Edinburgh taverns and coffee houses soon saw the distribution of a pamphlet titled Proposals for a Fond to Carry on a Plantation, which explained the scheme in detail. It did not mention Darien, but proposed an immensely powerful company with quasi-statehood of its own, empowered to buy ships, pursue commercial opportunities in countries not at war with William, claim land for the Scottish Crown, form governments where necessary, and create the Bank of Scotland. There is no need to take up any time in setting forth the usefulness of plantations in general to all places, or to the Kingdom of Scotland in particular, seeing now at length persons of all ranks, yea, the body of the nation, are longing to have a plantation. Now let's be absolutely crystal clear. The opportunity Patterson and the Company of Scotland referred to was not simply trade in luxury goods, but people. Darien was excellently placed for the trading of African and West Indian slaves to the Spanish South Americas and British and French North American markets. The door to the seas Patterson had spoke of was in fact the door to the plantations, a national chattel house through which the inexorable business might flow to Scotland's great enrichment. Scottish merchants were deeply envious of the English company's monopoly on the slave trade, and it was considered only just that Scotland should be granted a seat at the imperial table, profiting upon the misery, desperation and indentured servitude of fellow men and women, conveniently deemed to be subhuman. The participation of Scottish elites in the culture of slavery was just as enthusiastic as that of any ignorant, well-fed investor of the East India Company. Horrifyingly, not even Highland clan chiefs were averse to selling their Gallic tenants to the Americas as slaves to make ends meet, and much of the slave cloth bound for the New World was actually made in Inverness by indentured Gaels. This inconvenient detail of Scottish history is often skipped over, either through simple ignorance or because it doesn't fit with the popular narrative of noble martyrdom the likes of Sir Walter Scott and Robert Louis Stevenson invented to sell their books. For more on Scotland's role in the slave trade, check out Scottish History Tour's excellent video on just this subject. And so the Company of Scotland Trading was formed, with William Patterson as its leader. The scheme was wildly ambitious, projecting a plan for the next 30 years and presenting Scotland as a new imperial power in waiting. It wasn't long, however, before cracks would begin to appear between the company's personnel in Edinburgh and those in London. The two factions were at odds where the company should be based. Patterson insisted on a London headquarters for simplicity of negotiation, while those in Edinburgh saw it as only fitting that the Company of Scotland should be administrated from Scotland's capital. The English distaste for the Scots and the Scots' envy of the English played its part, and the English East India Company complained that its livelihood would be threatened by the Scottish Company, a line of argument taken up by English merchants who saw too much potential for French influence in the Scottish enterprise. 2 cargo-laden ships of the East India Company had recently been attacked by French privateers, with the loss of significant capital to its investors. The very last thing they wanted was another potential threat from a wildcard Scottish startup that seemed to be openly antagonistic to English interests. When the Company of Scotland spoke of ambition and economic independence, the East India Company and its allies in the establishment heard rabid anti-English sentiment. While not wholly unfounded, this perception contributed to a growing hostility towards Paterson's scheme. Some Whigs even claimed that the Scottish contingent were all Jacobite, and that the whole plan was a means to break free from the Union of the Crowns. It was made clear that the Scots should speak with respect for His Majesty and the English commercial class, despite said class being free to use whatever racial slur they fancied with regard to their Scottish contemporaries. The London faction of the company became increasingly irritated with their Edinburgh colleagues' refusal to even furnish them with a copy of the Act, when copies of the unofficial Proposals pamphlet were being circulated among London's political class, in other words, mostly the company's enemies. Eventually the Edinburgh faction came to London, but they were greatly displeased by what they found. The proposed level of investment, £300,000, was far in excess of their estimates, and furthermore, Paterson himself stood to profit disproportionately well from the scheme. It was questioned by London financiers whether there was even enough liquid capital in Scotland to meet the total subscription requirement. But such was the London faction's ambition, this grand undertaking could not be done on the cheap. No effort or expense was to be spared in laying the foundations of the Scottish Empire. Indeed, many interested parties saw such a high figure as, to borrow a phrase, reassuringly expensive. This was a serious endeavour that promised serious profit. No sooner had the official subscription book been opened in London before it was filled at the full £300,000. Greatly surprised that such a sum had been raised by the second poorest country in Europe, the English establishment now turned its full wrath upon the impudent Company of Scotland. Both Houses of Parliament delivered an address of protest against the scheme, which amounted to the renowned political diktat, "It's our ball and they can't play." William, irritated by the distraction, declared that he had been ill-served in Scotland. Wait, now you realise that? In January 1696, the board of directors of the company were forced to testify in front of a common select committee, who duly called for their impeachment. This made all subscribers withdraw their funding, and the London venture collapsed. Paterson returned to Scotland, determined to make his plan a reality despite such dangerous opposition. He was not alone in resenting the prejudice and disingenuous politicking of the English establishment, and Scottish interest in the company increased, galvanised by the old enemy's distaste for the enterprise. So the English Parliament thought that it could deny Scotland its share of empire, huh? Not on Paterson's watch. In February, the company opened a new subscription book in Edinburgh, this time for a total of £400,000. This was it, the last roll of the dice. Scotland had to shoot for all or nothing. The fire of resistance to English subjugation paid a rich dividend, and again the company was fully subscribed in short order, with investors rushing to get their name upon the roster. The Company of Scotland united most of lowland Scotland in a common cause, with poor Edinburgh tenement dwellers and landed merchants alike, all pledging what they could spare to see the scheme succeed. By the time Paterson handed off his plans and papers on Darien to the company, with his formal recommendation of its suitability for a colony, almost half of total Scottish capital was now invested in the proud nation's final desperate gamble. Now that the company was fully funded, the hostility of its opposition increased. The East India Company issued a thinly veiled warning to the Scots in a statement that forbade its vessels and crew from engaging with the Scottish company in any way, even in an emergency, and that all efforts would be taken to undermine the Scots' endeavour upon the seas. William now deeply regretted his initial support for the company. The last thing he wanted was for his northernmost kingdom to become less dependent on England. William condemned the Scottish scheme as dangerous folly, reprimanding the company for its impudence and inconvenient levels of ambition. To the company, however, this resistance from England, and particularly from the unpopular Dutch Billy, served as a powerful motivation to see the scheme come to fruition. Now, what Patterson had likely been reticent to mention in all his earnest lobbying, however, was that Darien was not simply a spare bit of territory lying around that no one wanted. The Isthmus of Panama was, like much of coastal South America, under Spanish dominion. Spain, as you'll remember, was a Habsburg monarchy and key member of William's Grand Alliance. Now, the likelihood that Spain and its puppet governments of Panama and Cartagena would simply turn a blind eye to Scotland's annexation of such a strategically important territory instead of blowing the Scots out of the water on sight was not great. This was one of but several calamitous misjudgments that would prove fatal to the Darien endeavour. In November 1697, the company assembled its newly acquired merchant fleet in the Firth of Forth in preparation for the first expedition to Darien, comprising the ebulliently named vessels the Dolphin, the Unicorn, the Endeavour, the Caledonia, and the St. Andrew. From January to June of 1698, the ships were loaded with supplies, while councillors and officers were selected for the first expedition, including one of the villains of the Glencoe massacre, Captain Thomas Drummond, butcher of Inveregan. Closer to departure, these were joined by volunteers, that is, those of sufficient background to avoid getting their hands too dirty, and planters, who would definitely be getting their hands dirty, doing the hard labour of Scotland's imperial expansion. These were mostly soldiers with family, discharged from duty such as those of the Argyll Regiment, who saw the expedition as preferable to pauperdom at home. Many of these Highland men had no language but Gaelic. The first expedition to Darien comprised a total of 1,200 colonists. On July the 14th, the fleet left Leith, made various stops on the way to pick up supplies, then sailed southwest across the Atlantic to the Caribbean Sea. Here, nestled at the very narrowest stretch of land between oceans, lay the Golden Bay of Darien. On November the 2nd, having visited Kirkcaldy, Madeira and the West Indies en route, even claiming a nondescript atoll called Crab Island for the company, the expedition reached what they christened Caledonia Bay, site of the proposed colony. The settlers struck ground at what would become New Edinburgh, and began construction of Fort St. Andrew, where they would place the 50 cannon they had brought with them. One colonist, John Dalrymple, no, not that one, imparts the following in his memoirs. On the other side of the harbour, there was a mountain a mile high, on which they placed a watch-house which, in the rarefied air of the tropics, gave them an immense range of prospect to prevent all surprise. To this place, it was observed, that the Highlanders often repaired to enjoy the cool air and to talk of their friends whom they had left behind. The left behind included the significant amount of colonists who had died from illness on the long voyage. The settlers negotiated with native tribesfolk who could speak a broken Spanish. True enough, these natives, or as the settlers called them, Indians, knew exactly where the gold could be found, but they also knew exactly where the Spanish could be found, and these almost naked, nose-ringed locals were certainly not as primitive as the Scots thought they were. Of course, to these native people, the Guna, the new arrivals, were just more pale-faced invaders after their gold, only these were even harder to understand. Now we should make it clear that the Scots did not abuse or mistreat the Cuna. Indeed, the tribe much preferred the Scots to the brutal conquistadors. But beneath the Scots' friendliness lay the same motivation: to take the Cuna's land. The fact that the Scots had offered to pay for the land rather than simply taking it by force is a distinction without a difference. A colonialist with a patronising smile is still a colonialist. But negotiate they did, and even sent cordial greetings to the local Spanish governors, which suggests either astonishing naivety or astonishingly ignorant bravado. One native man they named Andreas, who came to frequent the colony, and another Ambrosio, became the unofficial local ambassadors to New Caledonia, agreeing a treaty of trade and cooperation with the settlers. They asked the Scotsmen if they were here to displace the Spanish. The visitors said they were not, and at present had no quarrel with the conquistadors. The native men smiled at each other. Some of the Scots party questioned whether these guys were actually double agents, you think? Besides, where were the Spanish? They would have to be treated with sooner or later. But Andreas said the Spanish ships were elsewhere to the west. Besides, the colony had more immediate concerns. It's clear that Patterson, despite his obsession with the place, had never actually been to Darien before recommending a nation gamble over a third of its liquid capital into its colonisation. Put simply, there was a reason why this part of the isthmus was uninhabited. It was an area of swampland rife with mosquitoes and bordered by thick jungle that had to be cut back if you wanted to do anything with it. This meant the colonists had to use higher ground for planting, where the soil was thin, dry and infertile. Crops inevitably failed due to this poor soil and infestation by local fauna, which the colonists lacked any experience in dealing with. To compound matters, sickness was taking a devastating toll on the colonists, the Scots having no immunity to mosquito-borne diseases such as malaria, dysentery and, well, you get the idea. December saw the arrival of the Maurepas, a French frigate seeking refuge from Spanish forces. The captain was given amnesty, but would not divulge why the Spanish had engaged them. Many suspected this privateer had raided nearby Spanish holdings, and that the Maurepas carried a cargo of stolen gold and booty. The captain told the Scots settlers that he had seen Spanish ships gathering in the west. When the drunken crew of the Maurepas seemingly inexplicably set sail into a swelling tide the next morning, they were dashed upon the jagged rocks of the outer bay, the Maurepas sinking with over half its crew and all of its cargo. The survivors were rescued by the Scots, but seemed in ungrateful, antagonistic mood. It turned out that the Maurepas had indeed been laden with Spanish gold, silver and trading goods, and this, equivalent to a small national fortune, all lay at the bottom of the sea. Letters from the wreck would later wash ashore, revealing that the Spanish were trying to warn the native people not to cooperate with the Scottish settlers or face the wrath of France and Spain. On the 28th of December 1698, the Settlers' Council declared the settlement a colony of the Company of Scotland. Its high cost in lives to sickness and malnutrition was noted stoically. These brave souls had died in the name of Scotland's freedom. There wasn't much to show, however, for their sacrifice. Their rudimentary settlement lay on an exposed peninsula, and comprised little more than an unfinished fort and a hamlet of wooden huts. For this, 76 people had died between July and Christmas Day. The majority of these were planters, which, for all the pretty bluster of the Declaration, showed the class system was the only thing thriving in this promised land. Predictably, the Spanish were enraged by this apparent British act of aggression that, they heard tell, their so-called ally at the time, William himself, had given his blessing. William moved swiftly to condemn the Scots settlement and reassure the Spanish that the matter would soon come to naught. But the Spanish saw that in reality William had no control over the Scottish settlement, and they would have to take matters into their own hands. Seemingly, however, the Spanish greatly overestimated Scottish military capabilities and saw this as the tip of a planned British invasion. In January 1699, the Spanish Barlovento, or Windward Fleet, dropped anchor at Portobello, a military port just west of Darien, as the Spanish governors decided what to do about these disingenuous interlopers. Meanwhile, the company and its supporters in Scotland petitioned to have the Scottish Parliament send an address to the King requesting the protection offered in his statement of 1695. The proto-Scottish nationalist firebrand Andrew Fletcher of Salton wrote, "They must not think that we have so far degenerated from the courage and honour of our ancestors as tamely to submit to become their vassals, when for 2,000 years, whoa, steady on, we have maintained our freedom, and therefore it is not in their interest to oppress us too much. If they consult their histories, they will find that we always broke their yoke in the long run." But their yoke had now infiltrated the Scottish Parliament. Despite the national patriotic fervour around Darien, and Scottish public opinion generally strident in its opposition to English arrogance and intimidation, the Edinburgh politicians were reading from a different hymn sheet. The Lords Seafield, Marchmont, Queensberry and the new Duke of Argyll were the chief opponents of this protest, influenced from the shadows by the nefarious Master of Stair John Dalrymple, murderer of Glencoe. Now Viscount Stair after the death of his father, John Dalrymple was a fanatical advocate of a full political union between Scotland and England, largely because it served as a means to defang the troublesome Scottish Parliament, which was now filled with far too many Jacobites for Stair's liking. The company's address to the King did not make it through the Scottish parliamentary process without being significantly altered to render it as inoffensive as possible to the King. Marchmont called it an address to His Majesty in such terms as shall please him.
"I'm so sorry."
It should come as no surprise that turning a document of protest into a simpering declaration of loyalty to William did not exactly endear the Scottish Parliament to the wider Scottish population. In January, the Dispatch left Leith with much needed supplies for Darien, but was wrecked off Islay. In February, the first encounter with the Spanish saw the Dolphin driven into neighbouring Cartagena, where it ran aground and was ultimately captured by Spain. The next day saw a land skirmish in which Montgomery routed an attack by the President of Panama, Conde de Canilla. Meanwhile at the colony, Andreas and Ambrosio had disappeared and were rumoured to be dead. But it was later that month that the final straw for many of the struggling settlers came in the form of a worldwide proclamation from William that spelt doom for the colony. In His Majesty's name and by command, strictly to command His Majesty's subjects whatsoever, that they do not presume on any pretence whatsoever to hold any correspondence with the said Scots, nor to give them any assistance of arms, ammunition, provisions, or any necessaries whatsoever, either by themselves or any other for them, or by any of their vessels or of the English nation, as they will answer the contempt of His Majesty's command at their utmost peril. This was war. William's minions claimed that the King had been unaware of the true nature of the Scots' enterprise, and that their activities were not in line with his encouragement of 1695, which of course they were almost to the letter. This devastating betrayal meant that no further supplies could be shipped to Darien. The colony was now in desperate need of food, medicine and clothing. The settlement was populated by starving, yellowing inhabitants, as disease and malnutrition left men too weak even to finish the ditch around Fort St Andrew. The Scots fleet was merchant-based and had no vessels capable of tacking into the wind, which meant that they were trapped in the Bay of Darien if there was a strong northerly wind, unlike the advanced and terrifying Spanish Barlovento fleet, which could move quickly and effortlessly in any direction, a formidable tactical advantage the colony could not hope to counter. But the hubris of the Council of New Caledonia knew no bounds. There were those who publicly stated a wish for Spanish attack in order to demonstrate the new artillery guns now mounted on Fort St Andrew. Many of the colonists, however, took William's proclamation in the spirit in which it was dealt, and the council realised it could not prevent an evacuation from a settlement that had long become a living nightmare. So many had died that there was not enough able manpower to properly bury them. Of the 1,200 settlers who had arrived the previous summer, nearly 400 were now dead. Disease and starvation had ravaged the settlers of their pride and defiance. The dream was over. By June, the colony had been abandoned except for 6 sick men. The ships sailed to North America while the wind was favourable, and some made it back to Scotland. By any sensible reckoning, this should have been the end of the affair, but the Company of Scotland was determined to recoup its massive investment. The board of directors not only failed to disclose the abandonment of the colony to the public, but doubled down on the now inarguably doomed enterprise. Later in 1699, a second expedition left the Clyde bearing another 1,200 colonists, under the impression that they were headed for a thriving tropical paradise. In reality, the majority were being sent to a slow, painful death. The dream they had been sold would be brutally shattered upon their arrival at New Caledonia, where they found Thomas Drummond, 2 sloops, and overcrowded burial grounds literally overflowing with the dead. Survivors later wrote of the ever-present, inescapable stench of decomposing flesh that pervaded the settlement. The company had tried to deny what it called the desertion of the colony, but the reality was painfully apparent in the hellish scene of death and despair that was New Edinburgh. The council and officers called a meeting at which it was agreed that all women and 500 men were to be evacuated to Jamaica. In its death throes, the colony of Darien, like the Company of Scotland during its conception, was riven by factionalism. Differing ideas and opinions between the settlers now turned ugly. Those deemed to be deviating from the original vision of the colony began to be labelled as criminals and even mutineers. Thomas Drummond had floated a plan for he and around 50 men to go native with the Indians, living independently so as to solve the problem of both descent and lack of supplies. This was dismissed by the council outright, but in reaction to the decision, one volunteer, Alexander Campbell, made the mistake of pointing out that if the council would not adapt to the changing situation, there was a possibility of rebellion in the colony that could see its masters swing from the proverbial yardarm. The next day, Campbell was arrested and imprisoned aboard the Duke of Hamilton without trial. In December, he was executed by hanging on the charge of mutiny. Drummond too was arrested and imprisoned, but likely due to stories of his bravery during the 9 Years' War, was later released. In January of 1700, William surprisingly agreed to ask Spain to release the crew of the Dolphin. While at the colony, Robert Turnbull had been to visit the natives and returned with news that the Spanish were preparing for an imminent attack. February saw the arrival of the militaristic Campbell of Fonab, who wasted no time in bringing the fight to the Spanish, winning a much celebrated victory at Tubacante. But Thomas Drummond knew that there would be a fearsome retribution from the Spanish, and by now he had had just about enough of this godforsaken endeavour and its boneheaded leadership. Drummond left Darien shortly before said retribution arrived in the form of Don Melchor de Guevara, who landed to the east of the colony and quickly rebuffed an attack by the Scots, holding the landing site for his backup to arrive. This backup was Don Juan Pimienta, who made landfall later in the month with significant reinforcements. Pimienta offered the Scots terms of surrender, but despite the settlers' desperate situation, the council stubbornly refused to give in. They were determined to persevere in the face of now impossible odds. Ideology, bitter resentment and nationalistic fervour had long since replaced logic in the minds of the colony's leadership. Pimienta, surely nonplussed at the Scots' increasingly pointless resistance, advanced forward to the neck of the peninsula. Here, the only obstacle was a rudimentary ditch that the Scots had dug as a makeshift defensive position, and it would do little more than slow down any invader. On March the 18th, the Spanish duly crossed the ditch, ending any serious hope of the colony's survival. Now the council finally saw sense and asked Pimienta for a truce with a view to agreeing terms of surrender. But then the squabbling colony council members could not reach agreement on how to proceed, and hostilities resumed on the 22nd. At the end of March, Pimienta again offered terms which the council now had little choice but to agree to. The Articles of Capitulation were signed on March the 31st, 1700, which allowed the Scots to leave with their artillery, if they made it snappy. On April the 12th, the colony was abandoned for a second time, and Pimienta took possession of Darien. The settlers left on the Hope, the Rising Sun and the Duke of Hamilton, while the Hope of Bowness was sailed to Cartagena, where it was surrendered to the Spanish. In May, the Scottish ships reached Jamaica. Later in the month, the Scottish Parliament reconvened, but Queensberry refused the company another address to the King, adjourning Parliament instead. This act of dissociation, together with the news of the Battle of Tubacanti, caused widespread rioting in the capital. That night, the city of Edinburgh was under the control of armed mobs, and Whigs such as Queensberry battened down the hatches, fearful for their lives. In July, the Hope, the Rising Sun and the Duke of Hamilton left Jamaica bound for home, but the Hope became wrecked off the coast of Cuna. Encountering further adverse weather, the Rising Sun became dismasted, but it and the Duke of Hamilton managed to make it to Charleston in Carolina by late August. However, barely a week later, both ships were destroyed in a hurricane. In October, the Scottish Parliament met again and the company embarked on a fruitless lobbying campaign to establish Darien as a legal settlement, thereby falling under the protection of the Scottish Parliament. I mean, guys, do the words barn door, horse and bolted ring a bell? The colony of Darien, founded in such defiant vigour, had ended in a dreadful, humiliating capitulation, cut down in its infancy by chronic infighting and mismanagement, English betrayal, and Spanish contempt. We have no record as to how many of the 2,400 colonists who sailed to Darien survived the catastrophic endeavour, but estimates suggest that as few as 30 people made it back to the British Isles, which would represent a staggering mortality rate of 98.7%. Scotland's great gamble had failed. In the fetid, odorous decay of New Edinburgh lay the ruin of the Scottish nation, an unprecedented financial disaster most terrible in its implications. The country had not only lost nearly half of its liquid capital, but its dignity and its ability to function without assistance, condemning Scotland to a poverty and dependence greater than ever before. Little did the company know that in their misguided attempts to join the great game of empires, they had in fact destroyed the one thing that they sought to protect, the ability of Scotland to make its own way in the world as a sovereign nation. For nearly 1,000 years, the Scots had resisted invasion and insurrection to maintain their often bitterly won right to political autonomy. But from the disaster of Darien, there could be no return. Amid the wreckage of New Caledonia, torn asunder by the cruel winds of fate, lay the dream of Scotland's independence. Thanks for watching, and we hope you enjoyed the film. In part 2, Union, we'll investigate the controversial choice of heir to Anne, the game-changing War of the Spanish Succession, the long shadows cast by Darien, the deaths of James VII and II and William of Orange, the political chicanery in London and Edinburgh that led to the creation of Great Britain, and the Jacobite response in the attempted rising of 1708. Until then, enjoy your adventures.